Hi, friends. I miss you guys so much, and I miss teaching you. I miss learning from you and with you, and I really, really miss reading to you. So today, I've decided to read to you one of my favorite books. It's called Mr. Lincoln's Way by Patricia Polacco, and she's one of my favorite authors. And I believe that we have read one of her books this year. Thank you, Mr. Fokker. And we also, I'm not sure if we read this book, but there's another book that I want to read to you guys, and hopefully I'll get to in the next couple weeks, called Pink and Say. That's my favorite book that she wrote. I love the way that she writes, and she also is the illustrator of the book. So when the library opens again, I hope you get a chance to check out some of her books and look her up. She is wonderful. This book, Mr. Lincoln's Way, is about a principal who, of a school, of an elementary school, and he really loves his students. And there's one particular student in this book that we're going to talk about named Eugene, and he is sort of a bully. And so Mr. Lincoln really helped change things for Eugene and how he treats people, and we're going to find out how he does that. We're going to be thinking about the theme as we read, and we've talked about theme a lot this year, and we know that the theme is just the message or the lesson that the author is trying to teach us, and sometimes we can learn things through the characters and what they're learning. So we're going to talk about the theme and what that could be in this book. I hope you guys really enjoy it. Mr. Lincoln's Way by Patricia Polacco. Mr. Lincoln was the coolest principal in the whole world, or so his students thought. He had the coolest clothes, had the coolest smile, and did the coolest things. He had tea parties with Mrs. West's kindergarten every spring. He took Mr. Bliss's sixth graders on nature walks in the fall. He set up his telescope next to the pond in the back of the school on special nights and invited kids and their families to come and look at the stars. And in the winter, he was Santa for the Christmas play, lit the menorah for Hanukkah, wore a dashiki for Kwanzaa, and a burnous for Ramadan. Mr. Lincoln was just plain cool. Absolutely everybody thought so except Eugene Esterhaus. Mean Gene is what everybody called him. Mean Gene sassed the teachers and beat up on most of the other kids on the playground. He was no student at all. He drove Mrs. Dunkel crazy in English. Miss Chu wanted to drop him from art. And he was a bully. He always seemed angry, picking on kids and calling them names. "He's not a bad boy, really," Mr. Lincoln said, "only troubled." To just about everybody in the school, though, Eugene was trouble spelled with a capital T. So Mr. Lincoln sees Eugene a little different than maybe the rest of the school does and the other teachers, and we're going to find out why. Then one day he leered at a first grader. "What you looking at, scumball?" So that word leered, I want us to look at. It says, then one day he leered at a first grader. A leered means kind of giving them like a side look, like kind of a glare, a mean kind of a look, a sneaky look. "What you looking at, scumball?" he said. And he pushed her down and wrenched her backpack away. "I'm going to tell Mr. Lincoln," she announced. "Go ahead, you little brat. I ain't afraid of that." Then he stopped. Mr. Lincoln was standing right there. The bell rang and Eugene scurried away. Now Eugene was in Mr. Lincoln's thoughts more than ever. He knew he had to find a way to reach him. So it sounds like Eugene was about to call that little first grader a name that he should not have. Then one day, as Mr. Lincoln was helping the fifth grade plant a tree in the beautiful new atrium, he noticed that Eugene was looking up into the branches of one of the other trees. There sat a bright red cardinal. 2 other days, Mr. Lincoln had seen Eugene standing at the atrium window watching birds on the trees. Mr. Lincoln wondered, was it possible that... So an atrium is a kind of like a glass, it could be like a glass building with no ceiling, where they could have trees and nature for people to look into. And so in this case, he's looking at the birds and the trees in their school atrium. It wasn't a day later when Mr. Lincoln called Eugene into his office. Eugene slumped into a chair. Mr. Lincoln took a beautiful book out of his desk drawer, a book in blazing color and all about birds. He turned to one page and studied the illustration. I've got these little birds all over my tree, and I don't know what they are. Eugene got out his chair and walked closer. Those are red-clapped nuthatches. Weird to see them this time of year. You seem to know your birds, Mr. Lincoln said with a warm smile. I do. When I lived on my grandpa's farm, he had tons of birds around. Chickens, thrashers, meadowlarks. We raised carrier pigeons together. You've got quite a grandpa, Mr. Lincoln said, but Eugene just turned his back on Mr. Lincoln and left the room. Looks like Mr. Lincoln is finding something that Eugene might be interested in. A week had gone by when Eugene ran into Mr. Lincoln by the atrium, looking glum. When someone looks glum, they look a little bit sad or down. I have a problem, Mr. Lincoln said. So? The atrium was supposed to be full of birds, but they're just not coming. The principal looked into the empty atrium. Wrong plants in there to make them want to stay. Not the right food either. Eugene started to walk away. Your grandpa teach you that? Eugene turned and looked at Mr. Lincoln for the first time. Maybe. Do you suppose you could help us attract birds here to our atrium, Eugene? Mr. Lincoln handed him a book. And perhaps this would help. Eugene seemed stunned at first. Then he took the beautiful book on birds in his hand, wrapped it in his arm, and bolted down the hallway. As the days passed, Eugene never seemed to be without the book. His English teacher let Eugene read passages from the book in class. I'm so pleased to see him reading, Mrs. Dunkel exclaimed. Mrs. Dunkel is the same one that was frustrated with him at the beginning. So now that he has this book he's interested in, he's actually a student that she claimed he wasn't before. And when he didn't have his nose in that book, he was almost constantly out in the atrium. He and Mr. Lincoln made a list of plants and shrubs to buy and types of grain and seeds to feed the birds. They even built these feeders together, 3 feeders together. So that's them working in the atrium with the new plants. That's when it started to happen. The birds began to come. Nuthatches, bluebirds, and tanager, and many colored finches. So many different kinds that the whole school stood from time to time to just watch the wonder of them in the atrium. Eugene seemed genuinely happy. He didn't even tease the other kids anymore. Wonder why he's not teasing the other kids anymore. Then one day, Miss Chew burst into Mr. Lincoln's office. There are 2 mallards nesting in the atrium. Mr. Lincoln rushed to the hall, and sure enough, there in the atrium were 2 male and female mallard. And there was their nest near the southeastern corner of the atrium. Mr. Lincoln saw Eugene on the other side of the atrium giving him a thumbs up. I was hoping that they might be a mating pair, Eugene said one day as he and Mr. Lincoln looked at the 5 perfect eggs in the nest. Just one problem. The ducklings will need to be near water. They'll need to get to the pond outside. They can't fly out of the top like their parents. You'll think of something, Eugene. I know you will, Mr. Lincoln said, and he put his hand on Eugene's shoulder. It was nice that Mean Gene wasn't mean anymore. What I'm seeing is that Mr. Lincoln really is proud of him and really believes in Gene. It was only 3 days later that there was a commotion in the hall. A commotion is like a lot of things happening at once. Mrs. Belding rushed into Mr. Lincoln's office with Eugene in tow. Mr. Lincoln looked at Eugene in disbelief. What happened? I'll let Eugene tell you, Mrs. Belding trumpeted. But Eugene said nothing. He just sat looking hateful and defiant. Trouble in the lunch line? She went on. He singled out 2 of our students from Mexico. He called them brown-skinned toads and other unacceptable names. I'll take care of this, Mr. Lincoln said quietly. Mr. Lincoln sat down in the front of the boy. Eugene, my skin is brown too. Eugene just glared at Mr. Lincoln. This I know, Eugene. Someone who loves birds the way you do couldn't possibly have that kind of hate in his heart. Then Eugene began to cry. My old man got real mad when I came home late from helping you, he sobbed. He said that you're not our kind. So Mr. Lincoln said the words, someone who loves birds the way you do couldn't possibly have that kind of hate in your heart. And then Eugene goes on to telling him that my old man says that you're not our kind. He got mad at him for hanging out with Mr. Lincoln so much. Old man, he's referring to his dad. So his dad is telling him that Mr. Lincoln is not his kind because of his skin color. So, and I don't know if Eugene really feels that way about people, or maybe someone in his life, like his dad, is teaching him these things, these mean things to say or feel about people of different colors than him. So maybe it's not Eugene after all, but maybe he's influenced by someone else in his life. Our kind, Mr. Lincoln murmured. He led Eugene to the window of the atrium. It was alive with songs of the birds. I see sparrows, jays, cardinals, nuthatches, and the mallards. Don't all those beautiful types and colors make this a beautiful place to be for all of them? Eugene nodded. Yes. So he's pointing out how all of the birds in the atrium are so beautiful because they're all different colors. They're all different. Well, God made them all kinds, just like he made all of us, Eugene. Fact is, all of you children here with all your cool differences are my little birds. Yes, my little birds. And that should be your answer as to what is right and wrong in what your father said, Mr. Lincoln said quietly. So what I'm saying is he's trying to get Gene to see that he says that God made all of them, all kinds, just like he made all of us. So he's comparing the birds and the different colors and the different types of birds to how people are. So just because we're different colors or we have different color skin or because we come from different cultures or our personalities are different, that's what makes us all beautiful. So he's pointing that out to Eugene, that even though his father says the things that he does to him about people doesn't mean that he has to necessarily believe that. He's showing him that through the birds that he loves. My old man calls you real bad names, Mr. Lincoln. He got an ugly name for just about everybody that's different from us. Mr. Lincoln didn't talk for the longest time. Eugene, sometimes people get trapped in their thinking almost as surely as those ducklings will be trapped in that atrium. Mr. Lincoln said thoughtfully, my grandpa just wasn't like that. Mr. Lincoln put his arm around the boy's shoulder. I'd like to meet your grandpa. But Eugene, you have to promise me, even when bad things happen at home, here at school you need to treat all of my little birds with kindness and respect. No more teasing and name-calling. Please promise me. Eugene promised. I really love that he calls all his students his little birds. Eugene was good to his word. He became a model citizen. So when someone calls someone a model citizen, it's basically saying that they're a really good role model and people want to follow them because they do the right thing. He tried with all of his heart to keep his promise to Mr. Lincoln. Then one bright morning, Eugene stopped at the atrium window. The eggs were starting to hatch. He ran from room to room and brought the whole school to watch. The ducklings were hatching one by one. At first they were wet and then steady, but in a short time they were fuzzy and racing about. As the days passed, the mallard parents flew out of the atrium, landing on the pond just behind the school. They were leaving their babies for longer and longer periods of time. Eugene and Mr. Lincoln knew that the time was approaching when they would need to get the ducklings out of the atrium and into the pond. They had a plan. When the big day arrived, classes were asked to stay in their rooms. Then Eugene and Mr. Lincoln opened the door to the atrium and stepped in. They had both practiced saying, "Ying ying," like the Mallard parents. Now they talked to the ducklings, coaxing them to follow. The father Mallard waddled up to the doorway of the atrium and peered down the hall. At the end of the hall, the father Mallard could see the lawn and the pond. "Ying ying," Eugene called. The mother Mallard came out first. Then one by one, her babies followed. Eugene walked down the hall, calling to them over and over as the family waddled behind him. And then all at once the mother and father took the lead and the ducklings scurried after them. At the outside doorway they stopped for a moment. Then the mother and father Mallard jumped out of the doorway and coaxed each of the ducklings to follow. Mr. Lincoln and Eugene both stood and watched as the ducklings raced down the hillside and plopped into the pond with their parents. Now I know where the expression, "like a duck takes to water," comes from, Mr. Lincoln laughed. He couldn't believe how well the babies swam. Parents had gathered at the top of the hill. They had been invited to watch from afar. Then Eugene heard a voice from behind them call his name. "Eugene, boy, over here." It was his grandfather. The boy raced up the hill. Mr. Lincoln joined them. "This is my grandpa," Eugene sang out. "I know," Mr. Lincoln said. Eugene turned toward him. Had Mr. Lincoln something to do with this miracle, with his grandpa being here? Now the old man shook Mr. Lincoln's hand heartily. "I would sure like to stay with you again, Grandpa," Eugene said, as he and his grandfather walked up the hill again. The old man put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "We'll see, son. We'll sure see," he said. So his grandfather isn't the one that influenced him and how he feels about people who are different. It was his dad that did that. Later, Eugene and Mr. Lincoln walked down the pond together. Eugene needed to say something to Mr. Lincoln. "You showed those ducklings the way out, Eugene," Mr. Lincoln said. "Hey, you showed me the way out, Mr. Lincoln," Eugene smiled. Then he stopped and looked into his principal's eyes. "I'll make you proud of me, Mr. Lincoln. I promise." What do you think he means when he says, "Hey, you showed me the way out, Mr. Lincoln"? I think he means that he showed him what it's like to be kind to people that are different than us by really loving on him and taking an interest in what he's interested in, helping him see people differently through the eyes of birds. I think that's what he might mean. Eugene Esterhaus was true to his promise. He became a 4th grade teacher and called his students "my little birds." So I think that Mr. Lincoln influenced him more, even to when he got older, to become a teacher and then call his students, just like Mr. Lincoln did, his little birds. So we talked about theme a little bit before in the message of the story, and I think there's a couple messages or there's a couple themes, but I think the big one or the lesson that I want to focus on that Eugene learned was just because people are different from us or different skin colors or act different doesn't mean that they're less than anyone else. We're all the same, we're all equal, and I think that our difference is what makes us beautiful, and I think that's what he learned, and Mr. Lincoln taught him that through the birds and through his interests. And Mr. Lincoln didn't see him as the bully. He just saw him as someone that needed lessons to change his ways. And so with that, I wanted to ask you guys a question so that next time you can talk to your teachers and you can tell them that you answered this question. But I want you guys to write about something that makes someone a good leader. I hope you guys can see that okay. So Mr. Lincoln was a great leader, and he led the school and he led the students, just like teachers lead their students, and our principal, Dr. Pierce, leads us teachers and the students as well. So I want you to think about in your life, what makes good leaders? What kind of qualities or character traits do these people have that make them good leaders? Or what makes you a good leader? And just write, a paragraph, a few sentences about that. you can restate the question, I think a good leader is, if you want to, and then we can talk about this. Just let your teachers know if you want to have a video conference with me, I would love to. So we can Zoom and we can talk more about this. So I miss you guys, or we can just talk about life, whatever you guys want to. And I love you so much, and I hope that you're having a great weekend, and I hope you're staying safe.